So if you're on Zoom, we will start with the listing loop checklist. And then we're going to just kind of go through, and if you guys have any questions about anything on that actual checklist, and then we're going to go through the purchase checklist, and then we're going to go through the actual purchase agreement. We're going to read it line by line. So I'll have other people read, and then we'll kind of discuss it a little bit, fill it in as we go. And so I highly encourage you to take notes as we go through it, just so you can use this as a reference if you ever need that moving forward if you're writing a purchase agreement. Okay. So I'm going to open this up real quick. Still not on there? Okay. They're good. I don't know what's happening. Here we go. Okay. All right, so the first thing that we're going to go through is the listing loop checklist. So if there is nothing else that you have filled out for a listing, you have to have the exclusive right to sell agreement. That is like the one thing. So basically the exclusive right to sell agreement is your listing agreement with your client for permission to be able to list their property in the MLS. That has to be signed, and you have to have everything filled out. As we're going through the purchase agreement, you'll see what I mean when I say that in blank spaces, you should always put NA if you're not answering or if you're not filling in a specific box. The last thing you want, and it doesn't happen often, but the last thing you want is to like omit a box and not put anything in there. And then someone later down the line say, oh, well, actually it was filled in this way, and alter the document, and you can't actually prove that there was nothing in there. So make sure that if there's ever any blank spaces, just put none or NA if it doesn't actually apply. And we can take a look at the exclusive right to sell agreement too, because I know that a lot of people have questions about that, and that's pretty much like the one thing for listings. Over on the right-hand side on this list, it says required for compliance. So if it's going to be required by our compliance department, I'm not sure how many of you know, so our office, the reason why our E&O insurance is so low, it's only $130 a year, is because we have a separate compliance department that reviews all of our files and approves all of our documents and makes sure that signatures are on there and that it's actually like a valid contract, and that you're not missing anything within the contract. So these are, oh, is it not sure? Yep, I sure can. Okay, so basically those are going to be the documents that as the compliance department is going through your file in Command and your opportunity, those are going to be the things that are going to be required to be in there. If they're not in there and you submit your file, it's going to get kicked back to you and they're going to say you're missing X document. So you're going to want to make sure that these are the things that you're making sure that you're getting filled out. It's always easier just to do it up front when you're like receiving offers. Go through the checklist and just make sure that the buyer's agent sent you everything that you need. And then once your seller accepts an offer, obviously we have our Keller Williams like disclosures, send those over to them too, just get it out of the way. Last thing you want to do is like get a day before closing and be like, oh shoot, I don't have half of the things that I actually need for my file. And then you're rushing, trying to get everything signed. And then the seller's like, well, this is annoying, having to re-sign everything. I don't know, just get it out of the way. Do it initially up front, and just make sure that your file is compliant. So the Consumer Guide to Agency Relationships, obviously that's the document that just discloses the different types of agency relationships that you could have with your client, whether you're representing a buyer or a seller. The MLS agent full printout, that's a printout from the MLS. So if you go into your MLS where you search a property and it has the property address and all the information, all you have to do is right click and you can save it as a PDF, save it in the file and upload it. It's not anything crazy. It's literally just a copy of your MLS printout. Tax and legal, including the deed or the realist printout. To find the realist printout, excuse me. Basically, you just go to the realist tax tab on the top of your MLS. It'll open a second screen and you can just type in the address and it'll pull it up. Just save it as a PDF and upload it. Your exclusive right to sell agreement, which we'll go over. Residential property disclosures or exemption form, one or the other is always required. So if it's like an estate sale or they've never lived there, it may qualify for the exemption form, which basically states that they have no idea about anything pertaining to the condition of the property. If they have lived there, they'll fill out a property disclosure. General rule of thumb is they have to disclose anything within the past 5 years. My general rule of thumb when I'm having a conversation with my sellers, usually they'll ask if they've been there for a pretty significant amount of time, do I have to disclose something that happened 12 years ago? The answer is technically no, but yes, they should. I mean, they absolutely should. Like, because Amanda, isn't it like the rule of thumb is 5 years, but err on the side of caution, always encourage them or let them know that they should, anything that they know about the property, the last thing they want to do is omit information that they actually do know, and then a buyer find out that they knew and come after them and sue them.
Yeah, and by them telling you, you know too.
Exactly.
It's your responsibility to, even if they say, well, I don't want to, it's like, well, you told me, so now
I have to disclose it.
You have to disclose it.
Yep. So I always tell them anything you know about the property, regardless of when it was, have them put it on the property disclosure. Err on the side of caution, always. Lead-based paint disclosure, that is conditional. It's only if the property is built before 1978. Does our compliance department still require it just for our clients? Like even if it's built after 78, do they require it in the files still? No? Okay. So yeah, only if it was built before 1978, you need a property or a lead-based paint disclosure. The Ohio Real ABA, so that is required to be signed by your clients only if you're not using Ohio Real. That is one of the extra addenda. I leave that. For those of you that have your own ABA with Ohio Real, you can use your ABA that they send you rather than the company's ABA, because it still affiliates you with the company. It just has you added as an individual agent. In the event that you're using Ohio Real, both clients have to sign that ABA. But if you're using a different title company, only your client has to sign it, just disclosing the company's relationship with an affiliated company. Coming soon. So that's only applicable if you're using coming soon before going active in the MLS. Make sure the MLS has very strict regulations in terms of how they do that. Make sure that if you use a coming soon, that you email the coming soon and the exclusive right to sell to the MLS within 48 hours of it going on the market. Otherwise, you could get a $100 fine.
And because coming soon is so difficult, if you have any questions around it, do email me at broker.amanda.com. But here's the real quick rule of thumb. If you're doing coming soon, your coming soon document needs to have the date you're going active. So let's just say you're doing a 14-day coming soon. So the house is going active on June 14th, but the coming soon starts on the 1st. So on your coming soon document, the date that it says on the document is actually your active date. And on your exclusive right to sell, your actual active date is the coming soon date. So it's like they're the complete opposite. And you can't have anybody sign, you can't send in your coming soon paperwork until everybody's signed. So your client has to sign before you sign, so you can't pre-sign it. and you can't send the paperwork until you're coming soon. So you can't do it the day before and then come soon the next day. So there are 3 kind of complicated little tweaks. So ask me or Casey before you do it. It's an automatic fine. Okay? They're not cool about waiving it.
No.
Maybe one chance, but they're not
Um,
fining it.
It's difficult to hear Amanda.
Yeah,
she's all the way in the back of the room.
Oh, okay.
If you want to, it's up to you. Come on up, Amanda.
So the coming soon document has to be the actual date on the document, not the dates you're signing, but the date on the document has to be the active date. And on your exclusive right to sell, the date that you start the exclusive right to sell has to be the coming soon date. So they're the opposite. When you sign them, you cannot sign before your clients. So your clients have to sign them first, then you sign them, and you cannot send the coming soon paperwork along with the exclusive right to sell to the MLS until you've gone coming soon. So don't send it a week before or a day before. They won't accept it. Those are the 3 kind of rules that I find a bit complicated and that most agents ask us about.
And also keep in mind that you cannot change an active date in a coming soon.
No, you can't. So if you're coming soon for 10 days, you're going to automatically go active on that 10th night at midnight, and you cannot stop it now. If you sell something within coming soon period, so let's just say, Jenna, I heard you, if you put something on the market coming soon, and then D writes you a cash offer sight unseen, you have to have on that offer, houses never been seen by D. Creel and her clients. Both parties need to initial it so that you know you cannot break the coming soon rule. You cannot break the coming soon rule. Lots of agents think they can. You cannot break that rule.
Yeah.
Okay. And then guess what? It still stays coming soon in the MLS. You can't stop it. Like Casey said, you can't stop it. So even though Dee sold Jenna's house, it still says coming soon. Now we're going to write in the broker comments, sold before processing. We're going to wait for it to go active, and then we'll take it pending. So it's kind of like out of our control, and it's very complicated around coming soon.
Mm-hmm.
So ask me or Casey if you have any questions so you don't get fined.
Thanks, Amanda. So here where it says expected active date, so the first day, like Amanda said, of your listing will be the first date, the date that the coming soon starts. And then the active date will be here where it says expected active date, and this is what you cannot change. And then you'll have to sign this as well, along with your sellers, and then put the MLS number in there too. We can go through the exclusive right to sell real quick, because I know that's kind of a big, people have a lot of questions about this. Okay, so seller, the undersigned seller as owner having the right and power to act for the owner of the following property, the property hereby authorizes brokerage to offer for sale property at the price and terms stated below. So property, you're going to put the property address in there, here in the first line, Ohio, and then zip code. And then the parcel ID or tax ID, you can find that on Realist or on county website. And then you have to make sure you have a price in here as well. That might, if you're filling this out before you go to like a listing appointment or something like that, just make sure you go back and update it before anybody signs it. You have to have a listing price in here. Exclusive right to sell. In consideration of brokerage's agreement to diligently work to secure a buyer for the property, seller hereby grants to brokerage the sole and exclusive right to sell the property from, this first box is the start date. So this would be the start date that if you were to do a coming soon, that the coming soon would start. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So say it starts today, but you have a coming soon for 7 days. In the coming soon addendum, you would then have the active date as the 10th. So like Amanda said, it's kind of backwards with how you put those dates in. And then through midnight on, this is basically the expiration date of the listing. We encourage you to make this as long, like 12 months if you can. Probably doesn't need to be in this market because houses sell pretty quick. If someone doesn't feel comfortable, this is negotiable with your client.
Can I
So,
ask you a question
yeah.
about that?
Mhm.
Because before I had a strategy where I liked to do 90-day listings because, I mean, this isn't really appropriate for this market, but if it didn't sell, then you can start it over again and it goes back on the hot sheets.
Mhm.
As opposed to having one long 12-month listing. Why is that not a good idea?
So if it expires, there's just nothing committing your client to relisting with you, and then they could potentially go with a different
So
agent.
that's the only downside of it.
Mhm.
But, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my opinion, it's better to secure the listing for 6 months rather than have it go back on, because you can always withdraw it without relisting, or you can always withdraw it without release and then relist it, draw up a new listing agreement and put it back on the market. You'll have to do a new MLS, like fill it all in. You could literally copy and paste from the old MLS number, so most of the information will just fill in so you don't have to redo all of it, and then it'll come back on as a new listing.
Okay.
So I would encourage you to go that route rather than the listing actually fully expiring. So that's the exclusive period. So this basically means that you are the only agent that they're going to be selling their house with during this time frame. They cannot list their property with any other agent during that time. In the event of sale or exchange of the property at a price and terms stated or such other price and terms as may be accepted to seller agrees to pay brokerage a commission of, here you would write, so say you're charging, cake. Eat yourself. So say you're taking the listing for 6% total. You would write 6 here. I usually type it out and then 6%, put the number with the percentage in the smaller box. Or a flat fee. So say you're charging just like $10,000 flat and offering $5,000 to the co-broke. You can do that here instead where it says flat fee of. And if that's the case, you would just put NA in the percentage boxes. Otherwise, if you're doing a percentage, you can do NA. Unless you're doing both, whichever one ends up being greater depending on the purchase price, you can do both. An additional commission of $200 will also be due upon title of transfer of title. Our company charges a $200 transaction fee on every closing. So that is charged as an extra commission that goes to the market center. In the event that you're capped, you get half of that back. You get a $100 bonus on every closing after you cap. So you get half of that. Seller agrees to refer to brokerage all real estate licensees, customers, or prospects who may contact seller directly during the exclusive period or any extension thereof. So basically, if any buyer were to come wanting to purchase the property during the time that it's listed with you, that your seller has to guide them to come to you. They cannot negotiate on their own behalf behind your back. Seller agrees to immediately refer to KW Living all prospective purchasers or brokers who contact the seller and to promptly provide brokerage with all contact information relating to such inquiries. In the event of any sale or exchange of the property within 6 months after the exclusive period or any extension thereof has expired, it is further agreed that the seller will pay the commission described above if the buyer had contact with the brokerage or any real estate licensee regarding the purchase of the property during the exclusive period, and the seller knew or had been advised in writing of such contact. So basically, in the event that, say you have a house listed and a buyer comes and inquires about the property, and then for whatever reason, your listing expires 3 days later. The seller's like, I don't want to relist it. I'm going to keep it off the market. And they end up reaching back out to that buyer on their own and selling it as a for sale by owner to that buyer. That seller, because that buyer came during your exclusive period with that seller would still owe you your commission for 6 months after that. So they can't basically just like wait it out until it expires, get a bunch of buyers during that period, and then sell it to someone behind your back after it expires. Where am I at? You would have to, brokerage would probably sue them. However, seller shall not be obligated to pay said commission if seller enters into a written exclusive right to sell with another real estate brokerage during the protection period. So in the event that your exclusive right to sell or your representation period with them ends and 2 days later they sign up with another company and sell it with a buyer through that company, you wouldn't be due a commission. They basically just can't sell it within that 6-month period without representation otherwise, if that's the case. Cooperation. Brokerage shall extend an offer of cooperation to 1, buyer agents who are affiliated with the broker, and 2, buyer brokers who are members of multiple listing services. So basically any agent within our company or any other brokerage. Brokerage shall enter the property into certain multiple listing services subject to the rules and regulations, including without limitation, yes, MLS, which is our MLS. Brokerage reserves the right to determine at its sole discretion the real estate brokerages with which it will cooperate and the portion of its commission that it will offer to cooperating brokerages. So basically it's at our discretion when we charge like that full 6%, what we want to offer the co-broke company. Generally, you'll see 3.2. Sometimes you see 2.5. It really just depends on what you offer, but generally speaking, that's what you see probably 90% of the time. Of course, there's no standard commission. We're not allowed to say that there's any like required amount, but the way that I typically verbalize that to my clients is my company charges 6%. I also charge 6%. That is what I work for. If someone has an issue or wants to like negotiate that with you, you can negotiate it. Just don't discount yourself too much. You guys work way, way too hard and put too much time to like discount the services that you provide. And honestly, a good way to have that conversation with people too is like, you can definitely hire like a discount broker or somebody that charges a lot less, but like many things, you probably are going to get what you pay for. So if somebody's going to be working for a significantly lesser amount, how much more work do you think they're going to be doing on your behalf? I mean, we're talking about one of the biggest investments in people's lives. This is like hundreds of thousands of dollars. Do you really want to mess with it in that way? Probably not. And then the next box, basically, seller does or does not authorize the listing agent to grant access to the seller's property to licensed appraisers, inspectors, contractors, and other professionals. So basically, if there's any other like third-party person that needs to access the property for any reason, such as inspection, appraisal, that you have permission to be able to allow them into the property.
Can we recommend it?
Um,
I mean, I always think we weren't supposed to, but we're supposed to meet them there and not recommend it.
So this says for us to grant access for them. So this is basically saying that we are allowed to open up the door for them, or that like the buyer's agent is allowed to open up the door for them using the lockbox. Generally, I don't know if it's, I don't want to say it's illegal because I'm not sure if it's actually illegal, but generally we're not supposed to allow other people to access a property. Like if your seller's home and the appraiser comes and you schedule it and they're okay with the appraiser coming, they can allow them access. It is really up to your seller if they're okay with an appraiser using a lockbox, although I don't recommend that happening. It shouldn't happen. It's generally not legal to allow someone that's unlicensed to access a property. You could be liable just if something ends up happening. Not a good rule of thumb to like just give a lockbox code to an appraiser or an inspector and let that happen.
Okay, so you check off seller does, and then it's okay for me to bring seller further.
Yep.
Yeah, do this one.
What happened with my listings? I got a confirmation through showing time that an inspection was requested, and I just hit yes. And they automatically got the lockbox number. Luckily, my seller's down there and it's okay, but I thought,
The buyer's agent can allow access. So like when they put that in through the MLS, the buyer's agent is requesting access for the inspector. So the buyer's agent should be accompanying the inspector to the inspection to allow them
it
access.
was the actual inspection company and the health department that got a responded email on them with the lockbox number. That's what I keep kind of threw me
No.
off there. I'm like,
I always attend everything. If I can't, I pay someone else to attend it. Like if I can't attend an inspection with my buyer, I'll pay someone to go. If I can't attend like an appraisal, I usually end up bringing comps, because by the time you have a property listed to the time the appraisal actually happens, there's usually a 2 to 3 week gap there. You don't know how many like closings in that area you could have as like comps, like updated comps. And in the market that we're in, you're going to want those comps because they're probably going to sell for over list price. and validate the price that you're under contract for. So I highly recommend bringing comparable sale, like printout sheets to give to the appraiser, and also being there so you can answer any questions that they have as well about the property. Authorization to market. This paragraph basically just talks about you being authorized to market the property on different websites, social media, whatnot. Fair housing, basically we have to follow all fair housing rules. Disclosure, essentially the seller is agreeing to either complete the property disclosure or do an exemption form and then disclose any other material defects that they are aware of. Note, seller hereby agrees that brokerage and its agents cannot assist in the seller in completing the residential property disclosure form. When you give a property disclosure form to a seller, you cannot help them fill that out at all. Don't ever touch it. They have to fill that out on their own. If they can't figure out how to do it in dot loop, bring them a hard copy and let them do it by hand and then pick it up or have them send you a copy of it somehow. Electronic surveillance devices. This is fairly new since so many people actually have cameras on their properties. This is disclosing whether there is or is not some kind of surveillance on the property. Confidentiality, basically anything that's confidential in terms of the seller, what they're telling you, don't disclose that to anybody. And then excluded fixtures, if there's anything that they're keeping, such as they want to take their washer and dryer and refrigerator, ask them when you're doing the listing agreement if there's any appliances or fixtures that they're not going to want to leave with the property and then list them here. Home warranty. This only needs to be filled out in the event that they're offering a home warranty with the listing initially. This is not to say that it can't be negotiated later in a contract if it's included in there. Inspections, basically seller agreeing that they are allowing inspections to be done. Property maintenance, that it's their sole responsibility for monitoring and maintaining the property during the term of the listing until it sells. And the binding agreement, this is a legally binding contract. Sellers sign, print their name down there. If you want to put their address, perfect. And then email addresses, and then you sign here as the agent. Very straightforward document. Okay, and then we'll go back to the listing loop real quick. I want to make sure we have enough time for go through the purchase agreement. We're probably going to go a little bit over. I hope no one has any appointments. Oh, actually, I think I had it. All right, so coming soon, we talked about authorization to contact mortgage lenders. If that's obtained, that's conditional. If you have to change anything in the exclusive right to sell, like the listing price or exclusions or anything within the exclusive right to sell, you can do it on that document. If you're changing price, make sure you do an edit MLS listing form with the MLS and that you send it to them, or at least have it available if they request it if you get audited. If it's like a LLC or an estate sale or anything like that, make sure you have like a copy of like the power of attorney, the appointment of an executor, any type of like legal documentation that you need in terms of somebody owning the property. There is a lockbox sign and photo permission form. It's not required. I usually fill it out just to kind of dot my I's and cross my T's. America's Preferred Home Warranty application, that is required. Even if they're waiving the application, they have to sign the waiver on the bottom. And then the cybersecurity warning and acknowledgement addendum, that's for cyber fraud. That has to be like signed and uploaded as well. Other documents as necessary. Agency disclosure form for a listing. Once you go under contract, yes, that is going to be required. I don't know why it says no. CSS showing instructions, they're not required. Designated licensee agreement, that's if you're designating another agent to work on your behalf if you were to like go on vacation or leave town or something like that. If they're taking over and representing your client for you, that's the document you would use. Edit listing status change input sheet, that's what you would fill out if you have to change any major items such as price. Trying to think what else that would actually be needed for, or if you're like temporarily taking it off the market, putting it back on the market, withdrawing it with or without release, anything like that, that's what an edit listing status change input sheet would be for. If the property is winterized, you're going to want like a winterization letter acknowledgement stating that. And then in the event that, say, the seller wants to take it off the market for whatever reason, a release of listing agreement, you can either release it or not release it if you withdraw it. Yeah.
In that paperwork that you just went over, what is the ABA? It said that if you needed to, it said if you're using them or you're a partner with them.
So
I don't turn it in, so am I supposed to turn it in?
So you should have one for each file. Your client always needs to sign it, but the other party doesn't if you don't use the ABA, like that company. So say you're using Ohio Real and you have your own ABA, you can use your ABA that says like Kathleen Bergansky with Keller Williams Living. If you don't have an ABA with them, there's a generic one in the loop already that's just for KW Living. If the transaction is using Ohio Real, both parties have to sign that ABA. If you're using a different title company, only your clients have to sign the ABA, just to disclose the affiliation or like your relationship with that company. Only your clients have to sign it. You just have to disclose that you have a stock within another company. Okay, and then we'll go through real quick the residential listing loop. Purchase loop checklist. So like I said before, consumer guide is always required in every file. The MLS agent full printout you get from the MLS. Agency disclosure is always completed. If you have any questions about how to fill that out, let me know. There's 3 different sections. One is for the section A is for agents with 2 separate companies. Section B is for 2 agents with the same company. Section C is for only 1 agent and 1 client is unrepresented. Offer to purchase, which we'll go over. Residential purchase or residential property disclosure form or exemption form required. The Liberty Mutual loss history report request, that is automatically in your file. If your client does not want someone from Liberty Mutual to call them, just write on the top of the sheet, client not interested, have them initial and upload that. Escrow letter, obviously that is going to be sent to the title company closer to closing. You can fill it out, honestly, anytime from when you go under contract until about a week before. The sooner you send it, the better, because if you get closer to closing, they're going to be hounding you for it because they want to know what your commission amount is. So make sure you fill that out accurately. Cybersecurity warning, again, cyber fraud, promissory note or copy of earnest money check. Promissory note, so we'll go over these 2 and which one you use and when, but you'll usually use one of the 2. Removal of contingencies, that really is only used when you're removing contingencies throughout the process of the transaction. For your protection, get a home inspection that is required if you represent the buyer. There's 3 boxes on the bottom. They basically say, yes, my buyer chose to do a home inspection. No, my buyer chose not to do a home inspection. Yes, I received 3 qualified inspectors' information. So just check the appropriate boxes and have them sign that. Loss history report, it's not required. I would upload it in the event that they ended up getting that from Liberty Mutual. And then the Ohio Real Title ABA. And then we can go through the other documents as necessary. Those are also conditional in the event that you have that type of transaction. But to go through, am I shared? Okay. So who wants, I'll read the first part just to go through until line 2, and then who wants to read line 2 through line 6? Okay. So line 1 is you'll just input the seller's name. Make sure you get their full name. Like if their name is Robert, don't put Rob, don't put Bob, don't put Robbie. Put their full legal name with middle initial. If there's 2, put the first and then the second. Same with the buyers. So you'll do the buyer's names in there as well. If they have an LLC that they are selling under, that the property is under, make sure you put the LLC name on there. Agrees to purchase upon the following terms and conditions, the property known as the address. So you'll put the address there with the city, county, and then parcel number. Again, you can find that on county records or in realist tax. And then Kim, do you want to read line 2 through 6?
The property which buyer accepts in its as-is present physical condition shall include the land, all opportunity rights, privileges, and easements in all buildings and fixtures, including such of the following as are now on the property: all electrical, heating, plumbing, and bathroom fixtures, all window and door shades, blinds, awnings, screens, storm windows, curtains, and drapery fixtures, all landscaping, disposal, smoke detectors, garage door openers, and generally I put all
Mhm.
controls. All permanently attached carpeting, the following items shall also remain.
So lines 2 through 6, those are generally all fixtures within the property that will stay within the property. You'll notice on line 5, one of the biggest things that I see are people wanting to keep or take curtains. It ends up being a weird big thing with people, I swear. You'll come across it. If your sellers want to keep their curtains, just make sure, just put it in the contract. It technically doesn't need to be in there, but just err on the side of caution and put it in. Technically, like anything that's affixed to the wall, so like the curtain rods, those should stay. They're screwed into the wall. Sometimes you'll see people take them. Your buyer might ask for them to take it back. Honestly, unless like, I personally wouldn't want people's blinds, or not blinds, like curtains, because it probably matches their furniture and it probably doesn't match yours in all reality. But I don't know, if someone has like a specification on that, just ask. It's simple. Typically any kind of blinds, especially fitted blinds, those are all attached to, those are going to stay. 9 times out of 10, sellers are not going to try to take them because they probably will not fit into their new house anyways.
This just happened to me yesterday. I've been doing this 12 years and I've never had to specify that the window treatments,
Mm-hmm.
i.e. the drapes/curtains,
Yeah.
are staying or not staying.
Yeah.
And I had called the other agent. He's like, oh yeah, I'm like, then I just checked it because it's what I always do. And I go, well, the problem is it's a renter.
Yeah.
And they want their shit.
Yep.
So I have to know that you're okay with that.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, I said, call your buyer, please.
Mm-hmm.
And put it in the contract that you're good with no curtains and drapes, but the lines are good to go.
Yeah.
It's funny you talk about this because I've never.
It happened to me last week too. My mom just bought a condo and there was a renter in there before, and they even took the rods, the curtain rods. And my mom went and she was like, where the heck is everything? And I'm like, good question. And I texted the agent and I was like, those rods should not have left. He's like, well, they were the tenants. And I'm like, but again, the contract states that anything that's affixed to the walls is going to stay. Those should have stayed. And so the seller ended up giving her $100 to buy new curtain rods. I mean, yeah, sometimes it's like silly little things like that, but details to some people are just like, it is what it is. All right.
Okay, so I was in the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
1-6.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you not say all controls? Like, why is that even blank?
Because, so what if they don't have any and your buyer wants to make sure they have at least one?
Okay, so if you don't have, you would say,
Sometimes it's weird. Maybe they only use the keypad on the garage and they don't actually have any garage door openers. Mm-hmm. So I always put at least 1+, or if I have 2 buyers, I'll put 2+, because in the event with that being a specific number, the seller has to provide a minimum of that number. And so even if they don't have 2 right now, if I put 2+, they have to provide 2 and leave 2. They have to go buy it and set it and provide it.
That is a big issue, and you, as a listing agent, you have to pay attention to that number. Because what happens at the time of closing, your seller comes up to you going, I only have 1 garage door opener, and I go, well, the contract said 2, when I asked you.
Yep.
Oh, I think we do. Well, you better think hard because you're providing that too.
And you better go to Home
Whatever they
Depot if
say.
you only have 1.
So you're buying one, so you have to
Yep.
really have a heart-to-heart with your seller and read the contract
Mm-hmm.
to your seller, and ask them questions, do you have this?
Yep. Lines 7 through 10. So these are generally like basic things that are essentially going to be like appliances. Obviously, if there's a fireplace, it may have screens, it may have grates, it may have whatever. Make sure that you're checking the appropriate boxes based on what's in the MLS, and that you're acknowledging that if there is an appliance that is not in the MLS that your buyer wants, that you check it, but also let the other agent know, like, we understand that this is not included. However, my buyer does want it, so we included it in the contract. Sometimes the listing agent and the seller won't notice if it's checked in there. They'll end up probably countering it when they look through it. If there's anything else that's in there that's not one of these check boxes, sometimes they list like smoke detectors, garbage disposals, that kind of stuff. You can put that on lines 12 and 13 is also included. The likelihood of them taking their garbage disposal is probably slim to none, but again, err on the side of caution and just put it in there if it's listed in the MLS. Also, just when you're like showing the property, make sure that you're paying attention to things that are there. Like if they have a swing set in the backyard and your buyer wants it, put it in the contract. If they have a shed in the backyard that could potentially be like lifted and moved and your buyer wants it, put it in the contract. Anything that's, if there's like some kind of entertainment center or what, like a bar in the basement, put it in the contract. Just make sure that if there's anything that's even remotely questionable, that you're adding it into inclusions. If there's anything that's not included, typically in that area, I'll put seller's personal property, just because that somewhat specifies that their personal property should not be in the property after they leave. Does anyone have any questions about that section? All right, so lines 18 through 22. Does anyone want to read about secondary offers? Okay, I'll read. This is, box is or box is not a secondary offer. The secondary offer, if applicable, will become a primary offer upon buyer's receipt of a signed copy of the release of the primary offer on or before, and then you would put a date in there. So basically that the secondary offer would expire on that date in the event that it's accepted. Buyer shall have the right to terminate the secondary offer at any time prior to buyer's receipt of said copy of the release of the primary offers by delivering written notice to the seller or the seller's agent. Buyer shall deposit earnest money within 4 days of becoming the primary offer. So basically a secondary offer, say there's a listing and they accepted an offer from a buyer, but your buyer also wants to offer, and in the event that that first offer falls through, they want to be the default. They don't just want their offer to be considered or looked at again. They want it to automatically go to them. That's basically what a secondary offer is. So if your secondary offer gets accepted, it would be automatic up until this expiration date in this section. So the buyer has the right to terminate this as it's in secondary position at any point before the expiration date in writing. It has to be in writing. So say they're still writing offers on other properties for their like primary offer and they get one accepted and they haven't gone into the primary offer on this, they're still secondary, they can send in writing notification that they're canceling the secondary offer. In the event that this secondary offer goes primary because the first one cancels, they can't just back out for no reason. They are then under contract with them, and it would be treated as a normal transaction would be treated. Does anyone have any questions about secondary offers? Okay. Line 24 is price. So buyer shall pay the sum of payable as follows. So you would put the offer price there. Earnest money paid to the title company will be deposited in a non-interest bearing trust account and credited against the purchase price. So who can tell me what earnest money is? What is earnest money? D?
It's called consideration, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So it's basically like an act of good faith that your buyer's not going to get to the closing table, get through all of their contingencies, and then just back out of the transaction and not close. In the event that your buyer does that, they would forfeit their earnest money to the seller if it's based on something not related to any type of contingency within the contract. The reason for that essentially, so you have to consider on the seller's side that they've had their house on the off the market and under contract for that entire time that the transaction's been happening. And for them to have no compensation, still paying, probably carrying costs, their mortgage, all of that, it's essentially going to compensate them for the time that they've had that property off market. Because then they have to start completely over. In the event that your buyer terminates the contract based on a contingency within the contract, meaning inspection, a home sale contingency, financing, appraisal, anything within the contract that's a contingency, if they terminate based on one of those items, the buyer will get their earnest money back. Or they should, at least. Sometimes it's questionable depending on circumstances, and sometimes you have sellers that are going to try to fight it. but generally speaking, that will be the case. Lines 30 through 35, those are basically determining where, ooh, my computer's gonna die. That's basically determining who's going to be holding the earnest money. So it's either going to be going to the title company, it'll be going to the co-broke. Oh, sorry. No, that's whether it's going to be deposited immediately to the title company. So if you check the first box, that's when you would use an earnest money addendum. If you check the second box, that's basically stating that you're using a promissory note. You'll want to make sure you have a promissory note actually drafted up and using it. And that states that the earnest money will be deposited within 4 days of acceptance. I'm having problems here. No. Yeah.
Wait, the second one's the promissory note, what's the first?
The first one's the earnest money addendum. So that basically just specifies where the earnest money is going. Cash down payment to be deposited into escrow. So that's the down payment amount. So that's line 37. Mortgage loan to be obtained by the buyer. So basically line 39, say your buyer's putting 5% down. You should realistically be putting in actual numbers here. Sometimes you'll see either like TBD by lender, to be determined by lender, if they're not sure how much they're putting down. Sometimes you'll see a percentage. And then on the next line, you'll see or like for the cash down payment, you'll see 5%, and under mortgage, you'll see remainder. You should probably put an actual dollar amount in there. That's like best practice. So in the event that they're putting 5% down, take the purchase price minus whatever 5% is, and then you'll have the amount that's going to be their mortgage. And you can put that in line 39. Line 41, those are the different types of financing and or cash. So you're going to want to check one of those boxes depending on what type of loan your buyer is obtaining from a lender. If it's other, could be something like a hard money loan, USDA loan. If it's some other type of loan or financing, put other. Line 43, this is for closing costs requests. So basically what closing costs are, it's essentially, we're seeing it kind of backwards right now, but typically what this means, the verbiage in here, is asking for a seller to contribute X amount of dollars to the buyer's closing costs. And what that does is it saves them money on their cash to close so that they have more money in their bank account afterwards. So what we were seeing before in a pretty normal market is like a full price offer plus $5,000 because the buyers needed $5,000. So they were accounting for that within their loan, hoping that it appraises. And then being able to use that $5,000 that they're keeping and not bringing to for their closing costs to be able to do work on their house or whatever they need it for. Right now, what we're seeing sometimes is buyers offering to pay for sellers' closing costs to try to get a leg up, because we all know you can offer $25,000 over list price, but there's a really good chance that it's probably not going to appraise $25,000 over list price. So your buyer at that point, well, there's a few options. Your buyer would either have to bring the difference in cash, the seller would have to lower the purchase price, or you could do something along the lines of this, where the buyer is paying for the seller's closing costs. Even if it under appraises and they have to lower the purchase price, they're still getting $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 towards their closing costs. So the seller's still making more than what the value of the property is. Does that make sense? Okay. You wouldn't put it in here. So you would just put NA or like 0 in these boxes. And then under other, I would put just the opposite verbiage of buyers to contribute X amount, $2,000 towards sellers' closing costs and commissions paid at closing. Nope, so that would be separate from appraisal. So that would pretty much guarantee that the seller is going to walk away with a little bit more. And then if there's any other kind of like specific difference with the offer. So say you're using like a escalation clause. You can put under other see attached escalation clause. Like I would note it somewhere in here, not just send different addenda with the contract. And I would also make sure, just rule of thumb, that when you're sending an offer over, that you're doing like a overview of what the offer consists of and include any type of addenda, including like an escalation clause in that. Lines 46 through 56, financing. So this offer is conditioned upon buyer making a written application for the above mortgage loan within blank days after acceptance, as hereinafter defined, and obtaining a written, commitment for that loan on or about blank date. So generally you're gonna, what I typically do, rule of thumb, many buyers are already gonna have like their application done. So the first blank on 47, I usually just put 7 days to be safe. If they already have their application, you don't need, you can put 0. You can put NA because they already did it. Or you can put completed if you want to type that in there too, that's fine. Line 48, that blank date, I usually do about 3 to 5 days prior to closing. That's essentially stating that the lender is committing to providing the loan for the buyer. If despite buyer's good faith efforts, that commitment is not timely obtained, then this agreement shall be null and void upon signing of a mutual release by seller and buyer. The earnest money deposit shall be returned to the buyer without any further liability of either party to the other or to the brokerage and agents. So in the event that your buyer applies for a loan and they lose their job 3 days before closing, they can't actually obtain their loan because they have no source of income now, and their loan gets denied, they get the earnest money back and they can cancel the transaction. Obviously, at that point, they wouldn't get their inspection or appraisal costs back, but they have no way of buying this house. So financing, generally up until this date, is a contingency within the contract. In the event of a dispute between the parties regarding the earnest money, the escrow agent or brokerage is required by Ohio law maintain such funds in its trust account until either one of 2 things happens. First one, written mutual authorization of both parties specifying the disbursement and who that earnest money is going to. Second option would be a final court order that specifies to whom the earnest money would be awarded to. If within 2 years from the date the earnest money was deposited with the depository, the parties have not provided depository with signed instructions of where the earnest money should go, and or resolving the dispute, the depository shall return the earnest money to buyer with no further notice to the seller. So if that money is, if there's no agreement on where it goes and the earnest money sits in that escrow account for 2 years, that whoever's holding that money after 2 years, that title company can give it back to the buyer without notifying the seller. Lines 58 and 59, specify closing. All funds and documents necessary for the completion of this transaction shall be placed in escrow with the lending institution or escrow agent on or before blank date, and title shall be transferred on or about blank date. So the first blank date, generally I put the day before the day you want it title to transfer. Generally speaking, you're going to want like funds and documents in the event that your buyer has to sign the day before title transfer or closing. You want them to be able to sign the day before. So that's why I put the day before. You want it to be able to be received by the title company so they have everything ready to go. And then title transfer on or about will be the second date, so the actual date that you want your buyer to have possession. So your buyer cannot have possession of a property until title transfers, generally, unless there's some crazy extenuating circumstance. One time I had a seller who was also buying a house, and there was an issue with the underwriting on their loan, pushed them back 2 weeks, but they still closed on their listing. And they actually moved into their new property 2 weeks before closing and paid rent to the sellers of their new property. I've had it happen one time in 8 years. It like literally doesn't, it is very uncommon, highly frowned upon. So if you're not comfortable doing something like that, please reach out to like Amanda or myself if you have some kind of circumstance that like, because there's a lot of liability with something like that. Possession. Seller shall deliver possession and occupancy to buyer on or before 6 p.m. blank days after recording of the deed or blank, whichever is later. So on line 61, however many days, say your buyer's giving the seller 2 or 3 days to move out, you can put 3 days in there. You can put 0 days if you want possession same day. Really just depends on the needs of the buyer and the seller and what they agree upon. And then the next line on line 62, where it says deed or blank, that will be a date. So if there's like a specific date that they want possession by, it'll be on there. That'll be where you put that date in. If there is a significant like rent back, you'll want to use an addendum. It's a seller occupancy post-closing addendum, and that specifies what the rent per day is going to be and also security deposit. It protects your buyer as the new homeowner by requiring that the seller is going to keep utilities in their name, that they're going to have homeowners insurance in their name, and that they're still going to maintain the property like they owned it or like they're renting it. So there's certain specifications in there. If you have to use that, I would recommend just like reading through. It's not difficult to understand, honestly. Make sure that if you need title to transfer on a certain date, that the title companies only go to county usually once a day around noonish, maybe midday. And so titles transfer really only one time per day, and you'll get an email around 3 or 4. If your client wants to transfer on the same day that they sign, they need to sign early in the morning, first thing in the morning. Because if they wait until 11 or 12, the title company is not going to have time to get all of their documents situated and bring it to the county. And then title's not going to transfer until the next day. So make sure that you're in communication with your buyer in regards to their needs for like their moving plans, if they rented a truck, if they need access to the property and where all their stuff is going to be going and when. Line 65 through 75, title. Title shall convey a marketable title to buyer by general warranty deed and or fiduciary deed if required, with release of dower, free and clear of all liens and encumbrances whatsoever, except A, any mortgage assumed by the buyer, B, such restrictions, conditions, easements, however created, and encroachments as do not materially adversely affect the use or value of the property. C, zoning ordinances, if any, and D, taxes and assessments, both general and special, not yet due and payable. So basically, this is just stating that the seller is going to provide a clear title to the buyer and that any liens or anything that is on title currently will be paid off or handled before it transfers over. Seller shall furnish an owner's fee policy of title insurance from blank. I know it's on 2 lines. It's actually 1 blank space that just carries on from one line to the next. This is where you would input the title company that you're using. In the amount of the purchase price with the cost of the insurance premiums split equally between buyer and seller. So this is basically saying that the title insurance and owner's fee policy is going to be split 50-50 between the buyer and the seller. So most costs that are incurred by the title company for transferring the title, most of them are going to be split 50-50 between the buyer and the seller. There are a few that will just be paid for by the seller, and there's a few that are going to be paid for by the buyer, but generally speaking, most will be split. Seller shall have 30 days after notice to remove title defects. If unable to do so, the buyer may either A, accept the title subject to each defect without any reduction in the purchase price, or B, terminate the agreement, in which case neither the buyer, seller, or broker shall have any further liability to each other. Both the buyer and the seller agree to sign a mutual release, and earnest money would go back to the buyer. Does anyone have any questions about anything so far? We're getting there. Hang in there. I know it's like so dry. Contracts classes are the worst. I mean, they're great because like you learn a lot, but yeah, they're tough. All right, lines 77 through 90. Prorations. Tenant security deposits, if any, shall be credited to the buyer through escrow. Rents, if any, taxes and assessments, and HOA fees and assessments, if any, shall be prorated by the escrow agent as of the date of recording of the deed. So basically, when you have a closing date, all of the taxes and anything that's due is going to be prorated and paid for by whoever owns the property before and after. So those will be credited by the title company at closing on the settlement sheet. Taxes are paid in arrears. So sometimes you're going to see like a debit coming from the seller and then credit or a credit coming from the seller to the buyer, and then a debit coming from the buyer for taxes to the county. So like you'll see different amounts. If you're unsure of what something means, call the title company and ask them to explain it to you, because they are like the experts in settlement statements and where money is going. Taxes and assessments shall be prorated upon the latest available tax duplicate. The parties are advised to consult with the county auditor's office about the status of property taxes as any changes in proration when the tax duplicate for the calendar year of closing becomes available. If the property is new construction and recently completed or in the process of completion at the time of the agreement, then the escrow agent is instructed to make a good faith estimate of the taxes to be owed on the value of the improved property to the date of the title transfer and reserve sufficient funds in escrow from seller's net proceeds to pay those taxes when they become due and payable after title transfer. So basically, if it's like new construction and they're not sure what the tax amount is going to be, the title company is allowed to hold however much they estimate or think that is going to be needed to pay once they become payable and know how much it is. The escrow agent is instructed to release the balance of the funds on reserve once it receives notice from the county and improvements have been paid in full to the date of title transfer. The escrow agent shall withhold. Usually you see $200 to $250 here. This is a water hold. So they will pay the seller's last water bill. And then if there's any difference, say it's only $150, they'll send them the difference of what they had. If it ends up being more than that, then they're going to probably send a water bill to the property. The buyer will have it, but just have them reach out, or they'll reach out to you, I'm assuming, reach out to the listing agent and get that to the seller so they can handle it. The escrow agent is instructed to either pay said charges or verify seller's payment of said charges and remit any balance to the seller. In the event, property shall be deemed subject to any agricultural tax recoupment. You can check buyer, seller agrees to pay the amount of such recoupment. Most cases, I've literally never had this apply ever, but in the event that it's like an agricultural property, I always check seller. Be safe. I don't know. You don't want your buyer to incur any kind of like agricultural tax for someone else owning the property during that time. Chart.
Something. Do
Yeah.
you guys know what agricultural taxes are?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask them. For the crops?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what it is, the name of crop?
Yeah, so when someone has a large piece of parcel and they're farming it and they're getting agricultural tax, I actually have it on my property because my kids raise animals and we sell them for meat. So, if someone's making a profit off that, so let's just say, and I just sold a 70-acre piece of land with a little house on it. It was agricultural, zoned agricultural. If you don't check that the seller pays it and it transfers into your buyer's name and they don't use it as agricultural, your buyer now has to pay 3 years in arrears to catch up the taxes because you're getting a deduction. So let's say your taxes are $5,000 with agricultural, but normally it would be $8,000. So three years back, they save $3,000 each year. If you don't protect your buyer and say the seller will pay that, your buyer now is paying $9,000 to catch up those taxes if they're not going to farm a piece of land or use it as agricultural. Someone may buy a piece of land, huh?
Do they have to prove that they're using it agriculturally?
Yes, eventually your county will ask you to show proof that you're farming it, you're selling product off of it and making money off of it. So, so that's one thing. If you're going to keep I sold my property, another big piece of land, and they were going to keep it agricultural, so we did check the buyer, and I made sure the buyer called the county, understood what they had to do to keep that agricultural going, because they assumed it, so we checked the buyer, because the buyer is now doing agricultural, and then I explained to the buyer, in 20 years, you're gonna turn around and sell this house, you now will have to pay those back taxes if your next buyer doesn't keep it agricultural. So they have to know what they're getting into. Just a little tidbit.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathleen. All right, charges and escrow instructions. Basically, this section is stating all of the different types of charges that are charged at closing by the title company. So that would include, if you look at lines 90, I can't even tell because it's kind of off, 95, 94. Real estate transfer tax, any amount required to discharge any mortgage, lien, or encumbrance not assumed by the buyer. Title exam and 1/2 cost of the insuring premium for the owner's fee policy of title insurance. Prorations due the buyer, broker commission, 1/2 of the escrow, and then anything else that's going to be charged. 9 times out of 10, you're going to put NA in that box. Same with line 98. Unless VA FHA regulations prohibit payment of escrow fees by the buyer in case the sellers.
97 and 98 are one line. Is it two line?
No, it's one line. I would just put NA in both though, just so it doesn't carry over. And then tenant security deposits, if any, shall be credited to in escrow to the buyer. Buyer shall pay the following through escrow, basically all of those same costs, including $200 commission, the extra commission transaction fee that's in there. Line 104, you'll also put NA unless there's some other type of fee that's being charged. Line 105 and carrying into line 109, this is acknowledging a home warranty program that's available that would be paid with a deductible. So say you use a $425 America's Preferred home warranty. There's still always going to be a deductible that in the event that your client needs to call for that service, if something needs to be done, they're going to have a deductible that they have to pay. There's never any like $0 deductible plans. This section specifies whether on line 106 a home warranty will or will not be purchased from. That blank space needs to be the home warranty company at a cost of blank dollars. So if you're unsure, if there's a specific company that your buyer wants a home warranty from, look at their application online and see what plan they want and what they want included so you can put the specific dollar amount. Our America's Preferred home warranty application is already in the loop, so if you're not sure what they want, you can send it to them, ask them what kind of home warranty. I usually do like a $50 deductible one. It's a little bit more expensive than the $100, but I always try to go for more if you can get it. And if the seller says no, you can always bring it down a little bit if your buyer's okay with it. Or your buyer can pay the difference. It's not worth losing a deal over or house over. Honestly, they're like $400 or $500. And then it states which will be charged to either the seller or the buyer through escrow at title transfer. So it specifies who's paying for it. The parties acknowledge that the limited home warranty does not cover pre-existing defects in the property and that the broker may receive a fee from the warranty provider. So that's why for America's Preferred home warranty, you're going to want to fill out the data collection form. You get $50 back, a rebate for every home warranty that you use, and you have to fill that out, and then you get the rebate back. That's $50 no matter what. Lines 111 to 114-ish. This is basically checking. I always check both boxes just because I assume that the seller's agent probably wants to see a copy of the settlement statement as well. If you want to just check your clients, you can do that, just the buyers. But that's if you want the title company to be able to provide to you the settlement statement before closing to be able to review with your buyer.
How long is that limited warranty? How many days? How
It's a
is that?
year.
It's a year.
And then if they want another one, like if they can renew it, the buyer after the first year will have the option to renew and pay for it. Lines 117 through 121 is based on inspections. So this agreement shall be subject to the following inspections by a licensed inspector of the buyer's choice. All inspections to be performed in a timely manner from the date of acceptance of this agreement. In conducting buyer's due diligence, buyer assumes the sole responsibility to select and retain a licensed inspector for each requested inspection and releases seller and KW Living from any and all liability regarding the selection or retention of inspectors. If you recommend inspectors, make sure you send 3. Just like if you ever send lenders, make sure you send 3. If you ever send some kind of contractor, try to send 3. Give them options, because the last thing you want to do is say, this guy did a great job on my house. Highly recommend him. Not give anyone else. He does a crap job on your client's house, and then they come after you and say, this was a recommendation of my agent, and they try to make you pay for it. You don't want any of that kind of liability. So just always make sure you're giving them options in terms of like recommendations. If buyer does not elect inspections, buyer acknowledges that they are acting against the advice of the buyer's agent and brokerage. We always have to recommend an inspection to be done. If they decide that they don't want one, that is on them. Buyer understands that all real property and improvements may contain defects and conditions that are not readily apparent and which may affect a property's use or value. The parties agree that the brokerage and agents do not guarantee and in no way assume responsibility for the property's condition. Buyer acknowledges that it is the buyer's own duty to exercise reasonable care to inspect and make diligent inquiry of the seller and buyer's inspectors regarding the condition and systems of the property. Inspections required by any state, county, local government, or FHA, VA do not replace the need for buyer inspections. So like I said earlier during our office meeting, point of sale inspections, those are city inspections, in addition to the inspection that your buyer will still do. In terms of like appraisal inspections and appraisals, those are in addition to the inspection that your buyer is going to want to do. They are nowhere as in-depth as a qualified or licensed inspector going in and inspecting the actual property. Line 132 through 139, for buyer's protection, buyer is urged and advised to contact the local government of the property location to determine the possibility of any recent uncertified property tax assessments against the property, as well as the most current registration of sex offenders and predators. Searches of uncertified property tax assessments are only at the express request of the buyer's lender. Buyer shall be responsible for conducting buyer's own due diligence investigations and shall not rely on the representations of the seller or any broker, agent, or title agent involved in the transaction. So it's the buyer's sole responsibility to do their due diligence when purchasing a property for any special assessments and sex offenders, that kind of stuff.
Doesn't that come out when they do the title?
It might, and a seller should disclose it if they actually received anything in the mail stating like there's a new sex offender down the street or whatever. It may or may not, but even if it doesn't come out through title, a buyer should do their due diligence in looking for it. Buyers also urged and advised to perform the following inspections. So any city inspectors, health departments, VA, FHA, yeah, basically stating that any of those other inspectors don't negate the need for having an inspector to come in for them. 142 to 150. So these are different types of inspections that you're generally going to see. In the event that your buyer does not want any of them, you can check no to all of the boxes. They're going to want, at a minimum, a general home inspection. The other ones are really like if applicable. If there's a basement, I usually recommend radon. Lately, we've been seeing a lot of slabs have radon as well, so it doesn't hurt to have it done. If there's a septic system, you definitely want a septic inspection. Same with water potability if there's a well. Same with flow rate if there's a well. Those things can be pretty expensive if they are not in working order, so I would highly recommend having them inspected. In terms of a septic system cannot be inspected if it hasn't been used or lived in 30 days, if the property hasn't been lived in 30 days. So sometimes it may be difficult if you're selling or your buyer is buying a vacant property that hasn't been lived in 3 months and it's winterized. Probably not gonna be able to have a septic inspection. So you're gonna wanna figure out either some kind of like escrow hold or your buyer's just gonna have to risk it. Can be kind of tough. So, and then line 49, 149 is other. So if there's any other, say there's a pool and they wanna have a pool inspection, I know. You can put that there. If there's any other kind of inspection that they want to have done on the property, you can put that in there. Otherwise, I generally check yes to other. And then on line 151, I put any other inspection deemed necessary during the general home inspection. Any other inspection deemed necessary during the general home inspection. And then generally speaking, the inspections are always at the cost of the buyer. It benefits the buyer. They typically pay for all of their own inspections. So on the right-hand side under expense, you would check buyer under any inspection that they want to have done. If any of the licensed inspectors who have performed an inspection recommend further detailed inspections or additional inspections are required by lender, then the buyer will notify the seller in writing in 3 days of the completion of the last inspection and shall have an additional 7 days from the date of notification to complete the additional inspections. So say on day 4, usually under general home, you'll usually see 5 to 7 days, depending on how quick you can get an inspector out there. I would try not to exceed 7 days unless it's like a very drawn out contract for some reason or another. In the event that there's a home sale contingency, these dates are still going to apply once you go under contract. So it's important that if your buyer does not want to have an inspection done until they get their current house under contract, that's specified somewhere. So this is basically saying that within 3 days of the last inspection, they have to submit in writing that they're going to take those additional 7 days to have a specialist of some sort come out based on the inspection report found by the licensed inspector. All inspections are to be performed by the licensed inspector of the buyer's choice, regardless of which party is paying for the inspections. If you need some kind of like sewer scope or something, there are certain things that are going to need to be scheduled through the seller. Just keep that in mind. Your buyer won't be able to schedule a sewer scope with a company on their own. Buyer is responsible for ordering inspections. Seller agrees to provide reasonable access to the property for any and all inspections. Line 159 is the waiver that the buyer elects to waive each of the professional inspections that have not been indicated yes, and the checkbox checked. Any failure by buyer to perform any inspection indicated yes, herein is a waiver of such inspection shall be deemed absolute acceptance of the property and as is condition. So say they check yes on radon, they don't get a radon test, it exceeds the 9 days or the 7 days. Keep in mind for radon, those tests take 48 hours. So you're going to want to schedule the radon to be dropped off 2 days before. Generally, an inspector will be able to do radon as well. Most companies offer both. You're going to want to schedule them to go drop off the radon 2 days before the inspection so they can pick it up. Otherwise, you're going to want to make sure that you put like 9 days for radon rather than 7, depending on when they can get out there. Try to plan that appropriately. If the buyer is satisfied,
Call your inspectors ahead of time. So how do you know?
I usually call them like the day we go under contract and give my buyers options in terms of their availability based on my availability.
Right, but I mean, at that point, you don't know.
I'll usually schedule I'll be like, when can you drop off radon? And they'll be like, in 3 days. And then I'll be like, okay, so can you go out in 5 days for the inspection and pick it up? And usually they can. If it ends up not working out that way and they have to pick it up 2 days later, just make sure that it's within the deadlines in the contract. If buyer is satisfied with the inspection results and or does not notify seller of any defects within 3 calendar days of the completion of the last inspection, then any contingency pursuant to this paragraph shall be removed without further action, and they're buying an as-is condition. So basically, if they have their inspections done and they don't submit a removal of inspection contingencies stating that they want anything completed, anything like that, they want to terminate, they waive their right to request anything. And they are just purchasing the property in as-is condition. I actually had that happen like 2 months ago. I had a buyer's agent. I told her, I was like, we need the ROC. Today's day 3. 3 times that day, and she still didn't send it over. And then the next day the buyers wanted like $3,000. And I was like, your only option at this point is to waive it or terminate, which you really can't even do because you missed the deadline. And she was like, well, I didn't realize it was my responsibility to tell my buyers that they needed to do this. And I was like, well, then whose responsibility is it? Because it's not mine. They ended up having to waive all of their inspections. If in good faith, buyer is unsatisfied with any of the above inspections, then buyer must notify the seller in writing within 3 days of the completion of the last inspection. They must indicate one of, 3 things. First one is acceptance of the property in an as-is condition and just stating that they're removing the inspection contingency. The second is the intention to void the agreement and back out. The third would be they can request repairs to be done, a credit for repairs to be done to be credited to them at closing in the form of closing costs coverage, or a purchase price reduction. If buyer and seller agree to a resolution of the unsatisfactory condition, buyer and seller will draft and sign a written addendum to this agreement setting forth the terms of that resolution. If a resolution after the 3 days that the buyer has to submit the removal of contingencies, also known as the ROC, to the listing agent, they have 5 days to negotiate. If they don't come to a resolution within those 5 days, the contract's null and void. It cancels. There is no more contract unless you do an addendum extending it. And then the parties agree to sign a mutual release. Upon receipt of said release, escrow agent shall distribute the monies on deposit in accordance with the terms of the mutual release. In the event the buyer does not inspect the property within the number of calendar days specified or any agreed upon existence of the dates for inspection, then the buyer waives all the rights of the inspection and they're purchasing the property in as-is condition. The parties may agree in writing to extend dates for inspections, repairs, or the deadline for exercising their right to terminate. Seller agrees to provide reasonable access to the property for buyer to review and approve any condition. Ooh. Yeah.
Or back to line 143. With the general home inspections, we need, or any of those inspections, we say 5 to 7 days. Is this business days or is it calendar days?
Calendar days. Lines 184 to 192. They're checking yes or no on whether they want a pest and wood destroying insects inspection, basically who it is paid by. If you have a VA buyer, keep in mind that it will be required by the lender for the seller to pay for a VA pest inspection. The buyer is not typically allowed to pay for that. Also, if you have a VA buyer, generally they're not allowed to pay the $200 transaction fee either. It'll be waived. It'll be okay. So VA buyers, they're not generally allowed to be like forced to pay additional fees. So there's going to be a pest inspection that's required by their lender. The seller has to pay for it. It's usually about $150, anywhere from $1 to $150. And then they probably will not be allowed to pay the $200 transaction fee to KW Living either at closing. Kathleen? Nobody. It would just be waived for a VA buyer if they're not allowed to pay for it per the lender.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And I am not recommending this to anybody in this room. When your client says no to your inspections, let's just say they say yes to only the general, but they say for only purposes, for personal knowledge only, the inspection right now.
Yep.
Does our contract protect our buyer? Or if something has been found on the property, that they can still back out? Because I had a deal with someone, it hasn't closed yet, but when we were negotiating, we wrote it in, but she, and her mindset was, you wrote for personal purpose only for the inspections. You can't come back to my client.
It's still a contingency in the contract.
Yeah, I wasn't gonna argue with her because I figured the contract will protect my buyer. And I just didn't say anything.
Yeah.
What's the purpose of putting for personal use only then?
That means my client will never ask that seller to repair anything.
Or for any credits. They won't renegotiate at all. They're either going to take it as is or they're going to terminate the contract.
And I keep telling my clients, you have the right to back out if something is found on this house. It's $10,000 damage and you were only willing to do like up to 5 or something. They have the right to back out.
Yep.
Okay.
So I usually put a little bit of additional verbiage in regards to that. I'll usually put inspection for buyer's knowledge only. Buyer will not request or renegotiate the terms of the contract, but reserves the right to terminate this agreement should the inspection not be satisfactory. Or some type of thing like that, just saying, yeah, take it or leave it. Yeah, yep, that's usually what I do.
You would just put that in the general home inspection, that little line you put that in?
I would put that under other, like under specify. And then, or I would put it later, there's like additional terms towards the end. I would put it in the additional terms as well.
Not like in a box, and I know you're not allowed to do this, so I would put it in a box where it said 0 to 5 days,
Mhm.
and I would write a box, and I would put it right there. Is that okay, or?
I don't think you're supposed to add
You're
verbiage
not
to a
allowed to add
contract,
verbiage, correct.
but
So don't do what I did.
don't listen to Kathleen.
Okay, so,
But if you need to,
so in other, you would put
for
specify?
under other, I would put inspection for buyer's knowledge only. Buyer will not renegotiate the terms of this contract. You can put something like they will either move forward in as-is condition or terminate, or they reserve the right to terminate this agreement should the inspection not be satisfactory. Something along those lines. I try to be careful with verbiage just because that's like kind of on the border of practicing law, which we are not lawyers and we are not allowed to do. So just be very careful with verbiage that you input into a contract. Lead-based paint, 195 to 207. This is basically saying yes or no that the buyer is going to have a lead-based paint inspection done. I've had one person do a lead-based paint inspection ever. The problem with having a lead-based paint inspection done is that, generally speaking, pretty much every property before 1978 will most likely have lead-based paint somewhere, even if it's like layers and layers of paint underneath. If it's not disturbed, typically it's not a problem. And unless you have young kids that are going to walk around eating paint chips, it's probably not going to be a problem. The problem is that it's very unlikely for a seller to accept an offer from a buyer that's going to have a lead-based paint inspection done, because in the event that they have this done and lead-based paint comes up and the buyer backs out, that seller now has to disclose that that property has lead-based paint, and it's going to make it way harder for them to sell that home. So the likelihood of that happening is very, very, very small. So generally, you'll see no, 9 times out of 10. 9.9 times out of 10. 209 to 216. I swear we're almost done. Sorry. This is basically stating that the buyer has or has not received the lead-based paint disclosure. So by the first 2 check boxes on 209, that's stating that they have. So you'll know that you have received it. It should be in the supplements in the MLS. You can download it, then upload it into your loop and place the initial and signature boxes where you need to. If it's not provided, then you'll check either the 1 or 2 boxes after that saying that it was not provided. And then line 215, 216, this offer is subject to the seller completing the disclosure form and buyer review and approval within X amount of days. Usually I'll put 2 days. That's only if it was built before 1978. It's not required to be received if it was built after that. So you can just put NA there if it was built in like 2005. 218 to 229, loss history report. The parties agree that this agreement shall be subject to the buyer's review and approval of an insurance claims loss history report on the property. So that's basically when, like, the Liberty Mutual loss history report, that's what that is. It's going to pull any like prior claims on that property that the buyer would potentially want to know about. So that is stated in here that the buyer has the right to review and approve that report if they want it. Buyer understands and agrees that the buyer shall be solely responsible for obtaining the report. Within 10 days from the date of this agreement, buyer shall review the report and either remove the contingency in writing and buy in as is condition, or the buyer and seller may negotiate a resolution within 5 days or terminate this agreement by written notice to the seller if the report identifies material defects not previously disclosed in writing to the buyer. If buyer elects to terminate this agreement, the buyer shall provide a copy of the report to the seller and both parties agree to sign a mutual release, whereupon the earnest money will be returned to the buyer. In the event the buyer does not obtain and review a report within 10 calendar days of the date of the agreement, then buyer agrees that any contingency pursuant to this paragraph shall be removed, and buyer agrees to accept the property in present as is condition. In any event, buyer agrees that the closing of this transaction shall terminate any further rights to any inspection contingency, and buyer shall be deemed to have accepted the property in its present as is condition. 231 to 235, Megan's Law. Seller warrants that the seller has disclosed to the buyer all notices received from the local sheriff's department pursuant to Ohio sex offender law Buyer acknowledges that any such information may be no longer accurate and agrees to inquire with the local sheriff's office about sex offender registration. Buyer agrees to rely on solely buyer's own inquiry with the local sheriff's office as to registered sex offenders and not rely on the seller or other brokers. Condition of the property. Buyer has examined the property and agrees that the property is being purchased in as-is present physical condition, including any defects disclosed by the seller on the residential property disclosure. So it's basically stating that if something was disclosed on the property disclosure and then comes up later, they already knew that going into it. That's not something that's like renegotiable in terms of them asking for something later on a defect that they were already aware of. Seller agrees to notify buyer in writing of any additional disclosure items that arise between the date of acceptance and the recording of the deed. 241, that's basically stating that the buyer, you'll check that box and initial if they have received a copy of the disclosure form on X date of when they received it. That's what that blank is. It's kind of small. 244, buyer has not received it. And then 246, basically the seller has X amount of days from the receipt or acceptance of it to provide the property disclosure. And then line 250 is however many days the buyer has to review and accept and be okay with it and move forward. Walkthrough.
So how many days do you think?
I usually do within like 2 days of going under contract. So line 246, and then I'll do 2 days on 250. You can do 1 day if they're like, we have it, we just didn't upload it. You can do 1 day and let your buyer have 3 days if they want it. I mean, it's generally pretty easy to read. It's not going to take them 3 days to review a property disclosure. So you could do 1 day and 1 day if you want to. 254 to 263, this is a walkthrough contingency. So the parties agree that the buyer may conduct a walkthrough of the property on or about blank days prior to the day of title transfer. I usually put 1 to 4 just because you have to be there. So depending on your schedule and availability, I don't like limiting it to like 2 days. And this is solely for the purpose of verifying that the property is in the same or similar condition that it was in at the time of the execution of the contract. Absent of normal wear and tear. Buyer agrees that no issues may be arised as a result of the walkthrough that relate to any defect or condition existing as of the date of the agreement. If there is a material adverse change in the property's condition at the time of the walkthrough, the buyer, bless you, the buyer shall promptly notify the seller and the escrow agent in writing. Thereafter, the parties shall mutually agree in writing upon an amount to be either 1, held in escrow from the seller's proceeds pending correction of the material adverse change, or 2, credited to the buyer through escrow at the time of title transfer. The property shall be in broom clean condition and free of all personal property and debris at the time of possession or subject to agreement between buyer and seller. So that basically states that a seller can't leave a bunch of trash, garbage, debris, furniture, crap in the garage.
And what happens when you do?
They have to come take it out. Nothing. Really. Buyer can try to sue them if they want to. It's probably not worth the cost of suing someone to like get a dumpster and empty it all out themselves. Honestly, like if you go to the final walkthrough and there's still a ton of stuff there, I would make a note of it to the listing agent and just say like, I just want to confirm that the seller is planning on removing all of these things because there's quite a bit of stuff here. And hopes that they do. You can also go back like the day before the buyer signs or something like that. If it's not all removed, your buyer doesn't have to close. Is it worth holding up closing for? Probably not. I don't know. It's up to the buyer.
If you're not responsible for it, I need that.
No, it's not. It's not on us. There's nothing we can do about it.
I mean, the client, not us.
Yeah. Yeah, the buyer would have to assume that, take care of it, or sue them for the cost, bring them to small claims court for the cost of whatever it costed. I don't know. 265 to 271, representations and disclaimers. Buyer acknowledges that the seller has completed the residential property disclosure form and agrees to hold the brokers and their agents harmless from any misstatements, errors, and omissions made by the seller. Buyer also acknowledges and agrees that the buyers and their agents have no obligation to verify or investigate the information provided by the seller on that form. Buyer has not relied on any representation of the brokers and/or any agents regarding the use or condition of the property, square footage, zoning, lot dimensions, HOA fees, public and private assessments, utility bills, taxes, or special assessments, except as listed below. I usually put none, unless you're aware of any kind of assessment or something that was disclosed by the seller. Which sometimes there is. You'll see it in broker remarks. If the seller's aware of assessments that they're paying for like HOA or whatever, a lot of times you'll see those in broker remarks. And you
Well,
can,
the one that I closed today,
Mhm.
the settlement said that there was $750 resurfacing fee from Akron, from the city of Akron.
it may be like
Usually it was,
concrete or something. A lot of places do
Yeah,
stuff like
so-
that.
yeah, no, my seller was like, I have no idea what that is for,
They were probably redoing sidewalks or something.
and they said it was in that pure, I said, I can't find it online anywhere, and they're like, well, you won't, because there's this 1 year grace period, so. it's-
Yeah. Things like that are weird. When I bought my last house, the seller had an assessment that the title company missed, and it was $500 for 2 new sidewalks on the front. Seller didn't disclose it. Title company missed it, and then I had someone from the city come knock on my door and be like, "So we're replacing sidewalks in 3 weeks. Why haven't you paid for it yet?" And I was like, "I don't know what you're talking about, sir." So he's like, if you don't have it done prior to when we do it, we are going to do it, and then the city's going to charge you. So then I sent that bill to the title company because the notice came out before I even owned the house. So I had no way of actually knowing without, it should have been on the title commitment. They paid it. The title company did. It happens. Things happen. I don't know. Damage if improvements to the buyer. If improvements to the property are destroyed or damaged in excess of 10% of the purchase price prior to title transfer, then the buyer may either accept the insurance proceeds for said damage and complete this transaction, or terminate the agreement and receive the return of all deposits made. If such damage is less than 10% of the purchase price, the seller can restore the property to its prior condition. They'll have the ability to do that. 280 to 286, this is a legally binding agreement. Addenda, you're going to want to check any addenda that apply that will be attached to this contract. Does anyone know the difference between an addendum and an amendment? So an addendum is in addition to the contract. It is connected to the contract. An amendment is a change to the contract. So anytime that there's any type of like adjustment, that'll be an amendment. Any type. There are a lot of disclosures that are not actually listed on here. You can either put check boxes on here and type it in next to it and check it, or you can write down here where it says other. I usually move the box that's there right after agreement there, and I make it longer and I type them all in there. So you'll want to add like promissory note. If you use promissory note, you'll want to use like put in ABA, cyber fraud addendum, anything that's going to be required. If it's only required by one party to sign, you don't need to put it in there. So like your ABA, for example, if you're not using Ohio Real Title, you don't need to put it in there because you don't need to disclose to the other person's client that you have an ABA. Buyer signs, I would put in their email and phone number at a minimum here just because it helps the title company be able to reach out to people. 314 to 317, you're going to check one of these boxes. So either you already have received or acknowledged a check being made to the title company or wherever it's being deposited, or a promissory note for the earnest money. You sign here on 317. This is the agent's signature box. And then you can put KW Living Solon under office and then our office phone number. Acceptance. Seller accepts the above offer and irrevocably instructs the escrow agent to pay from the seller's escrow funds a commission per listing agreement to the listing brokerage at, say you're working with a Howard Hanna agent, you're going to put Howard Hanna on line 320, and then on 321 where it says address, in the MLS where the listing agent's name is, you can click on their office, and their office address will pop up in a separate page. So you just copy and paste. It's very convenient because I used to Google it. So just copy and paste it in there. Super easy. And then it basically just says that according to the MLS, compensation offered to KW Living at our address, and as the sole procuring agent of the transaction. Our commission is not typically in here. It doesn't need to be. I usually add a box right here that says buyer broker commission to be 3% on the first 100,000 and 2% on the remainder, or whatever is listed in the MLS. I just like to have it in the contract. I add that just on that, right under the address, our address, because there's nothing that goes there. I don't know why that line's there. And then seller information boxes. And then yay, last page. Just fill out everybody's information. The listing agent's license number will be in the MLS. Their broker office ID will be next to the name. So it'll say like 1234/Howard Hanna. That 1234 is their broker ID that you'll put in here. And everybody's names. That's all. That's all she wrote, guys. I know.
Okay, so I did have somebody that I'm working with right now that doesn't want to sign the liberty mutual insurance thing, and she's gonna go through her own, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So,
You can just put at the top of it,
so what am I putting on top of it?
buyer not interested, and then just have her initial it. And you can take her phone number and email off of it.
Okay.
It's only took 2 hours. Holy cannoli. But I hope this is valuable. Helpful for you guys. You guys feel better about writing contracts now? Awesome. Do you have any questions?
I can just, I'm just gonna add an initial box, right?
If any questions arise, let me know. For those of you in the PC program, if you draft any contracts, you want me to look at it before you send it to a buyer, let me know.
Oops. How do I get out of here? Uh-oh.
Where?
Yeah. Great.
Thanks for coming.
You're welcome.
Yay for education.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Of course. Does anyone need this still?
I'm gonna take a picture, so keep on. Alright. How did you get it to this whole? Oh, stop share.